Last week we began taking a look at the story of Esther, the unlikely Jewish orphan girl who became queen over all of Persia. We began our time in chapter 3 talking about the threat that had been placed upon the Jewish people at the hand of the wicked Haman. Recently, he had been promoted to number 2 in all of the Persian Empire, and Haman intended to exterminate the remaining Jewish people and that were still living in the country after they'd been allowed to return back to Jerusalem, rebuild the city. But the majority of people agreed to stay there, or decided to stay there, and so Haman wants them all taken out. And when Xerxes agrees to go along with this plan and takes off his signet ring and gives it to Haman, it was over. It was ball game. It was written into the laws and the Medes and the Persians. It was done. We know that through the historian Herodotus, that these orders came through in 474 BC. So all this begins to take place at this time. And so as the king and Haman are there drinking in the palace, it said when the word goes out that there was great confusion and people were in disbelief, and especially the Jews, much like the Jews in the concentration camps that were heading that direction in the ghettos of Warsaw during the late 30s and early 40s. They're wondering, why are we here? Why has this happened? Why are they doing this? And so we know that it happens during this time. And while God's people are completely caught off guard, God was not. And he began his story and his plans many years earlier, at the beginning of the reign of King Xerxes in the court of the great monarch. And as the monarch is gathering people from all over, from the surrounding areas, and his nobles to come in, trying to talk them into going to war with the Greeks, he throws this magnificent banquet. And at the close of this 6-month-long celebration and these 7 days of feasting, he invites the Queen Vashti, to come in and to present herself and show her great beauty to this room full of drunken men. And when she agrees and says she's not going to do it, and she tells him, I'm not going to come forward, he deposes the queen. He said, if you're going to be insubordinate and not come into my palace now and come before me, you'll never come again. Well, he goes off to battle and comes up short versus the Greeks. And a few years later, he returns back to the palace, and he's ejected and he's upset. And he drops his battle armor there in the palace. And he begins to think back, perhaps I was too hasty, getting rid of my beautiful wife, getting rid of the mother of my children. And so he goes through a long period of depression. And his attendants decide, we've got to do something to snap the king out of this. And so they agree he needs a new wife. He needs someone to be with him. And so they search high and low and start gathering up all of the eligible virgins throughout the kingdom. Well, the historian Josephus tells us there were upwards of 400 women that were gathered together for this competition. And the ideal is, let's get the most beautiful, eligible women in the kingdom, bring them together into a pool, and allow the king to select from them. And as they went out and sought the most beautiful virgins, they brought them out of their villages and brought them into Susa, the capital city. And they were given 1 year of beautification treatments and also some time of training to get them ready for their one opportunity to meet the king. And so all this is happening. And God is not surprised by this. And so we think of this competition. It's kind of like the TV show The Bachelor, but on steroids. Instead of like 20 girls, there's 400, and they're not staying there for a month. It's a full year. Don't you know that was a hot house of stuff going on in there? And boy, definitely a tough place to be. And so they're all vying for the same guy, and I'm sure a red rose, since it was the national flower of Persia. But even in a room full of just beautiful women, Esther stood out to Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the harem. Esther chapter 2 and verse 9 says this, and the young girl pleased him and won his favor. That's fine for the NIV to describe it that way, but I like how the original language translated this. She lifted up grace before his face. There was something special about Esther. Yes, the text tells us that she was beautiful, but there was also something else that made her stand out to the eunuch that was over all of these women in the harem. There was something unique about her. Her inner qualities could not be ignored. You know, I got to thinking this week with our own daughters and young ladies. I think we really need to focus less on exterior beauty and clothes and more on inner character. Because I really think within today's society, especially with media and different things, there's a huge pressure for our young women to look a certain way and to conform sometimes to very unrealistic standards that the world puts out, that this is what you're supposed to look like, this is how you're supposed to act, and this is the role that you're supposed to fill. Last month, a group of about a half dozen middle school and high school girls traveled to New York City and went into the headquarters of Teen Vogue in Times Square, and they demanded to talk with the editor there. And when they were given an audience, they presented to the editor 28,000 signatures asking the magazine to end its practice of digitally manipulating images and publications. Now, not just removing blemishes from models, different pictures, but also artificially making them even thinner than the girls that were in the pictures. So these young women asked the magazine and revealed to them that they're vulnerable readers, that when they're looking at these pictures, it presents a very unrealistic notion of beauty, and it threatens their very self-esteem, and is leading to depression among young women and eating disorders, just to begin the discussion. So as they're asking and asking for this, the editors agreed to meet their demands and to stop this horrible practice. So I think as fathers, and I think as men in this congregation, we need to talk with our daughters and our granddaughters, not so much about what they're wearing and how they look, but talk with them about their inner strength and character. And don't get me wrong, this text does say Esther was a beautiful woman, but what made her stand out is what had been put on the inside of her that will come out later in this story. You know, because of her inner beauty, the king's servant provides Esther with the choicest of food. He also provides her some servants to look after her. He gives her the best spot there in the harem. So, but in spite of all this pampering, in spite of all this luxury that she has, being one of the attendants in the Persian Empire and being there in the palace, in spite of all this, Esther remains focused on who she is, and she remained authentic and true to her upbringing. Haggai was not the only one that looked and took notice of this young woman. Esther chapter 2 and verse 17 and 18 and 20 says this: Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her the queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all the nobles and officials. And he proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts in royal liberality. But Esther had kept secret from her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done as he was bringing her up. Well, if this is your first time through the story of Esther, you're probably thinking, who is this Mordecai guy that's mentioned here in this passage? Well, the text tells us he was a Jew living there in the capital of Susa. And the text also tells us he's the older cousin of Esther that agreed to kind of take and to look after her after her parents passed away. So you have Esther, and he's kind of serving as her caretaker and guardian. Well, there's one more event that we need to look at before we get on to addressing this threat at hand from chapter 3. And it involves her cousin Mordecai. Esther chapter 2 and verse 21 through 23 says this: During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officials who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when this report was investigated and found out to be true, the two officials were hanged on the gallows. And this was recorded in the book of the Annals in the presence of the king. So what's the big deal? Why is this even included? You got a couple of thugs that are discovered. Mordecai hears this story and he says, Esther, you got to go tell the king. And the king says, well, let's look at it. And sure enough, it comes out to be true. Well, let's just say, we got to trust me that this is all part of God's plan. Well, I mentioned earlier that the king had promoted the evil Haman to second in command in all the kingdom. And the first exercise of his power was to take the signet ring and to send out this command, this edict, sent all over the kingdom about the Holocaust to the Jews. What was the motivation? Why would he choose to do this? Why would he make this the first act of his administration? This heinous act of taking out every man, woman, and child of the Jewish persuasion. Why would he do this? What is going on here? You know, I think as we look at this, Esther chapter 3 tells us that Haman's new title afforded him great respect among the people. And wherever he went, people stopped, held him in reverence, and bowed. Everyone except who? Mordecai. Mordecai wouldn't do it. And the text tells us that he wouldn't because no man deserved the reverence that he gave only to his heavenly Father. Esther chapter 3 and verse 5 and 6 says this, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. He found out that all of the people, that Mordecai's people were the Jews. Why was this so inflammatory? What is the big deal? I think there might be more to the story than this. So I want us to look at these two characters of Haman and Mordecai to see what's there. What's that bad blood? Is it just he wouldn't show him reverence? Well, Esther chapter 2 and verse 5 and 6 says, there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem from Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Well, you can look at this text in a couple of ways. One is to say that this is an abbreviated genealogy, and Mordecai's father was Jair, and his grandfather was Shimei, and his great-grandfather, well, he was Kish. But you can also look at this mini genealogy another way. What if indeed Mordecai's father was Jair, but then he gives three other people way back when in his family tree that the Jewish people would know and identify with. Three kind of mini celebrities within the genealogy. Let's take a look at that. Well, there was a Kish mentioned in 1 Samuel 9 and verse 1. Well, that was Saul's father, okay? And I think we discussed when we're going through 2 Samuel the story of David running from the palace, if you remember, because Absalom has put this coup into place. So he gathers up all of his stuff and they just run out. And text says David didn't even have shoes or sandals on his feet. And remember what happens as he's leaving the kingdom and running away. Well, a guy named Shimei comes up and starts pelting him with rocks. And so, David's getting hit, and, one of his armor bearers like, should I kill him? No, he may be from God. What was he so upset about? It said Shimei was from the family and the clan of Saul, and he was upset in how his family was treated when David took the throne. So all three of these men, Kish, Saul, and Shimei, along with Mordecai, are also from the tribe of Benjamin. Okay, so what does it have to do with Haman? Glad you asked. Esther chapter 3 and verse 1 says, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. What in the world is an Agagite? Well, if you remember back in 1 Samuel, what was the undoing of Saul's administration as he's king? I mean, things were going along fine. His text even says he was filled with the Spirit. What went wrong? Well, it began when Saul failed to carry out the Lord's instructions that were given through the prophet Samuel. Samuel had told him, the Lord wants you to take out the Amalekites. They're just a nemesis to my chosen people. If you remember, they're coming out of Egypt. It was the Amalekites that attacked them. The Lord says, it's time to rid ourselves of this foe. He says, I want you to take out all of them and take out even their animals. Well, the text tells us that Saul kept the chosen animals and cattle for himself, but he also kept alive the king, Agag. The Agagites were descendants of the king that Saul didn't kill. Well, of course, Samuel comes up and says, Saul, what have you done? He pulls his own sword and cuts the king's head off. But apparently, some of his family survived. And so the descendants to follow from generation to generation, these Agagites have passed down their hate for the Jews. And so Haman, being an Agagite, he'd been nursing a grudge that had been taught to him since he was a very young child. See, we're not taught. We're not born hating various people groups. That's something that has to be taught. You know, the saddest part of the field trip that Brian Bellamy and I took the other day to confront the Ku Klux Klan at their whites-only gospel meeting was watching these adults sitting around with their children and grandchildren, indoctrinating them and sharing their warped view of theology, a theology of hate. So Haman, Agagite, most surely had been trained to hate the Jews. And so now when he comes and he puts two and two together that Mordecai is a Jew, he's like, I knew it. I knew there was something I didn't like about this guy. Not only Mordecai, but all of his people have to be exterminated. All the people have to be taken out. Esther 4 and verse 1, when Mordecai learned that all had been done, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. Unfortunately, Esther had no idea that this edict had gone out. In fact, she's kind of isolated there in the palace, in the harem. And so word wasn't exactly getting around. But one of her eunuchs that was there attending to her and watching over came and brought her word and says, your cousin Mordecai is walking around in sackcloth and he's visibly upset about something. So Esther says, go and find out what's going on. Mordecai shared with the messenger a copy of the edict that had been sent out. He says, look, it's the king's signet ring has been put on this. It's official. It's happening. And Esther has got to do something. The Lord has put her in this position for a reason. You've got to tell her. Esther sent back word and said, it's not that easy. Anyone who approaches the king's throne, unless he's invited them in, then well, the rule is they're to be killed unless he steps in and gives the golden scepter. In fact, tell him I haven't been invited before the king in a month. It's been 30 days since he's asked me to come in. I'm his new bride, but for whatever reason, he didn't want me. I can't just walk in there and do this. Mordecai sends word back in Esther 4, verses 13 and 14. Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this? Esther takes this in, and she moves from fear to faith and abandon. And she says, okay, Mordecai, I'm going to trust you on this. I'm going to do it. But he sends word back to Mordecai, please tell my cousin to rally all the Jews in Susa. And I want you to pray and fast with me and in my attendants and those around me for 3 days to prepare me for what God is calling me to do. So after this 3-day fast, after she's physically weak, but spiritually strong, she gains her inner strength, and Esther makes her move. She puts on her royal robes, and she goes into the palace, into the king's chambers. She caught Xerxes on a good day, for he gave her the royal scepter, and basically says, my queen, thank you for coming to see me. I've missed you. Tell me, what is your request? Even up to half my kingdom, and it'll be yours. The king thinks he's in charge. I'm reminded of Proverbs 21 and verse 1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a water course wherever he pleases. Do we look at life that way? Do we look at people in authority, people that have an incredible amount of power, people that hold sway over us? Do we really view them as the end, or do we view that God is in control of all things? God's in control of every world leader. God's in control of our president. God is in control of our bosses. God is in control of everything. He can move things like a water course as he pleases. Well, confident of the Lord's presence with her, Esther doesn't ask for Haman's head on a platter, which I think I would have done. But instead, he invites Haman and the king to come to a great banquet. Well, the king's like, I love banquets. So he grabs Haman. He says, well, let's go. And so they go to this banquet that's been prepared for him. And they're full of wine. The king repeats his statement that he said earlier. He's like, Esther, anything you want up to half my kingdom, it's yours. Just tell me what it is. But Esther's remaining patient, and she says, all I ask is that the king and Haman return tomorrow night for another great banquet. Well, Haman could not have been happier. I mean, he's been given this new position, and now he's been invited to not one, but 2 banquets. So don't you know, he's got the new clothes, he's got the new position. Here, once in a while, when the lights come in, he'll kind of flash the signet ring. Yeah, I'm in control of the kingdom. And so he's on cloud 9. He's just bebopping out of there. He's so excited. Nothing could spoil his evening. Well, almost nothing. Esther chapter 5 and verse 9. Haman went out that day happy and high in spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage for Mordecai. So he goes back home and he gathers his family and his friends together. He says, you're not going to believe this. I got to go to a private banquet, and tomorrow night I get to go to another. And they're all like, oh, this is so wonderful. We're so happy for you. Your ship has finally come in. He goes, yeah, all this stuff, I can't enjoy it because of Mordecai. And his wife pipes up and says, Mordecai, you keep talking about him. Why are you allowing him to get under your skin, to be this burr under your saddle? In Esther chapter 5, verse 14, this is a great wife. His wife Zeresh and all of his friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go to the king to the dinner and be happy. Well, this suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. What a great plan. And so I imagine that night as he's trying to go to sleep, he's assembled this impromptu construction crew, and on through the night they've got lanterns around, and you hear the sawing and hammering as they're constructing this huge pole and putting it into the ground that's 7.5 stories high. What a show. And so probably he's having a hard time sleeping. He's not the only one that's having a hard time sleeping. After Esther chapter 6 and verse 1 and 2 says this, that night the king could not sleep. So he couldn't get one of my sermon tapes. So he orders the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. And it was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh. I actually think they are wrestlers. Those sound like wrestling names. Two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Okay? Final piece of the puzzle. Do you think that it was just coincidence that he couldn't sleep, that he has this insomnia? Do you think it was just by chance that of all the scrolls that were picked up, the reader just kind of picks up one and goes right to the story of Mordecai on the night when the Lord needed to come and to save his servant Mordecai? No, God's hands are all over this story. As he's reading through this, and I imagine a monotone thing, as the reader gets to the part about Mordecai, the king says, stop. What did we do for this guy who saved my life? And the reader's kind of looking over, nothing, my king. Peek your head out and see if there's anyone else there in the courtyard. And so the guys go, okay, well, it's now early in the morning, and they're like, well, Haman's out there. Well, we know why he's there in the courtyard. He's there at the crack of dawn because he's there to gain permission from the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows. The king says, well, great, bring him in. Esther 6 and verse 6, when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man who the king delights to honor? Haman thought to himself, who was there that the king rather honor than me? So the self-consumed Haman responds, for the man the king delights to honor, have him bring out the royal robe the king has worn, so everyone will know that I'm that close to him, and the horse the king has ridden, one with the royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes, and let the robe the man and the king delights to honor, and lead him around the horse to the city streets, proclaiming before them, this is what is to be done for the man the king delights to honor. And the king's like, great idea, Haman. Go get Mordecai and do what you just talked about. What do you do with that? He just has cold sweats go over. What? Mordecai? Humiliated, Haman leads his nemesis around, proclaiming this, leading the horse. Everyone knows he can't stand him. And so he's doing this, going through proclaiming this. So he finally gets done. The show is over. Mordecai goes back to his place in the city gate. And he goes back home. And he starts explaining to his wife this absolute humiliation. And his wife said, oh, honey, this is not good. In fact, this may be a bad omen about where this is happening. Mordecai may be the key to your downfall. You think? All right, there's no time to sulk because the eunuchs show up and say, hey, it's time to go to the banquet. Okay, so he starts heading towards for this final banquet. The text tells us after the food and wine have been served, King Xerxes, for the third time, repeats his offer. Please, Esther, up to half my kingdom, tell me what your request is. She finally felt the time was right. And the big punchline of the story in Esther chapter 7, verse 3 through 6 says, and Queen Esther answered, if I found favor with you, O king, if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. That is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet. But such distress would not justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Who is the man who's dared to do such a thing? And Esther says, adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Esther's words had to be very eye-opening for the king, for he had no idea of her nationality, had no idea that he had been duped into putting his lovely queen's life in jeopardy. And he had to be furious for his carelessness. And so there's this very awkwardness there And one of the eunuchs kind of joins in the conversation. And he says, there's this mighty tall gallows that are over at Haman's house that he's erected to hang Mordecai on. I'm just saying, it's over there. The king says, do it. Hang him. The story ends with Mordecai getting Haman's estate. He gets his position in the court. Before they impale Haman on this giant pole, they take the signet ring off, hand it to Mordecai, probably the last thing he saw before he died. And of course, a new order goes out from Mordecai, sparing the life of the Jewish people. Here's just a few thoughts. Hopefully this story has been very entertaining. I love this book. But there are a few things that we need to take away from this. Number one, God has plans to advance his agenda in his kingdom. Our omniscient God knows everything. He's not surprised by the events of the day. He knows what's going to happen tomorrow. He knows what's going to happen 2 years from now. Nothing will be a surprise. And the things he's done in the past and the things he's currently doing today all feed into that. He's not taken off guard. Sometimes those plans have been in place for thousands of years. Even before the world was created, the Lord knew at some point he would send his Son on behalf of you and I and all of creation. The Lord uses people, places, and events to accomplish his will. The second thing is God uses his people to fulfill his plans. Responding to the threat of the axis of evil, Winston Churchill spoke up and addressed the Houses of Commons in Parliament in the United Kingdom in June of 1940. And he explained exactly what they were up against and how formidable a foe, but yet how they needed to be strong and how they needed to rise up for such a time as this. And these are his famous words: "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth will last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour." We need to look at our lives that way. We have a lot of just ordinary days we get up and do different things, but there are some extraordinary days. Sometimes when the Lord gives us opportunities, and the Spirit will prompt us in those times, and he'll put on our heart, and we'll see that open door before us. We've got to be courageous to walk through those. I pray that in the coming years that each of us as individuals in the church, that this will be our finest hour. Finally, God used Esther. I'm convinced that if Esther had been unwilling to use her position or to secure the safety of her people, God would have used someone else. He would have used another person, another place, another event, something to change the course of history. But don't miss this. Esther was plan A. I guess it would have been cleaner if God had chosen Mordecai to save his people, for him to carry the day. I guess if Barak had gone into battle without Deborah the judge leading the way, it would have been a lot easier for us. If only King Josiah and Hilkiah the priest had consulted with Jeremiah the prophet, who was in the neighborhood, instead of Huldah the prophetess. But Huldah was God's choice of vessels to send his word. If only Moses and Aaron could handle things and the leadership and guiding their people without their sister Miriam, the prophetess. It sure would have been easier if Aquila could have taught the evangelist Apollos without Priscilla. It would have made things a lot clearer for us. But that's not how God did it. Esther was a woman of courage that matched her convictions. But she was also a gifted young lady that the Lord gave an opportunity to shine on the largest of stages. And we push our daughters to do the same, to boldly advance the cause of Christ. We need everyone doing that. So this is our prayer and the things I've been thinking about. I hope that the story of Esther will inspire us to be bold, no matter who the foe is or what the circumstances. Let's pray together. Lord, help us to see what you're up to. I pray that we'll open our eyes, that we won't get so caught up in our daily routines and what's going on in individual families. We fail to recognize what's happening, not only in this city, in this state, in this country, but around the world. Lord, use us as individuals in a church to fulfill your plans. Help us to use our resources and our talents and our time, Lord, to your glory. Lord, raise up our girls to be courageous like Esther. Cultivate in them the heart that desires to honor you no matter what the cost. Speak your message through their lips. Carry out your will through their lives. Lord, teach them to stand up for what they believe in, to be people of integrity regardless of the situation. Lord, in Esther's time of calling, she fasted and relied upon you. Lord, I pray that we not only teach them and model for them a spiritual conviction and inner strength. Lord, I pray that we will show them that we're going to do this as well. Lord, raise up a generation of Esthers, of Deborahs, and Priscillas. Lord, help us all to be fearless for you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.